listening to the GM Shuffle, presented by DraftKings and VSiN.
And welcome to the GM Shuffle, presented by DraftKings and VSiN. Dave Ross, alongside our GM, Mark Dominik. Mark, here we go. The offseason is officially upon us, but it's something that you brought up with me. It feels like, I don't know, well over a month ago now, that might be coming into fruition. And I want to start the show with it today. And it's a quote from one of my favorite movies, The Usual Suspects. A rumor isn't a rumor if it doesn't die. You mentioned that maybe the issues for Matty Stafford in LA could be monetary. And that, look, there actually could be a chance that they could trade places and maybe move on from Matty Stafford. We're hearing now, Mark, that the Rams are giving him permission and his agent to seek out a potential trade with another team. You are all over this from the jump. What does that say to you today with that new information?
Yeah, I mean, it's once you got permission to seek a trade right before the combine, that's basically saying that clearly things aren't going to work out, that that the negotiation is stalled, and that there's really no other way to fix this other than to sit there and say, hey, let's put him in a different location. It also tells me they have a plan in place already. You don't trade Matt Stafford and sit there and go, okay, we're good to go. Let's just see what happens. I think they have a very good plan in place. Look, I saw this. We talked about it, right? We saw this. I felt this was going to come back in the postseason. We were talking about this back then. And I saw everything kind of align because I understand where the salaries are. And you just are around this game enough, Dave, you just start to run into things that are like, that doesn't look like that's going to be the way it's going to play out, as good as Matt Stafford played for this Rams team. So, seeing the opportunity now for them to be able to talk to other clubs freely, talk about contracts, extensions, to me, that means it's kind of the end of the Matthew Stafford era in the Rams.
Wow. And obviously you mentioned it with the money. It would be a cap hit nearly $50 million this year. If he's on the roster, he could save almost $27 million of that with a trade. Obviously here, is that really why this is happening? Or is it more about Cooper Kupp and maybe, his departure? That didn't seem to sit right with Matty Stafford here, because this is a team, Mark, that I think some could say we're a play away from beating the Eagles, and we all saw what the Eagles did last year.
Yeah, play away from beating the Eagles, having a chance to maybe play the Commanders that weren't at their A game and maybe could have been in the Super Bowl. I mean, it was a play or two away from that, but certainly a team that's gone through a massive overhaul. We've seen it in terms of the defensive side of the ball. They're one of the younger teams in the NFL. When you remove a Cooper Kupp and now Matt Stafford, you're certainly going to be one of the youngers, but I don't know if they'll stay young at quarterback. That's the thing that you and I have talked about as well, that I just don't feel like probably the direction they'll go as an organization. Doesn't mean they won't draft a quarterback, but doesn't mean that they'll play a young quarterback in 2025 for that regular season. But again, I think it's just come down to the fact it wasn't the Cooper Kupp reason. I think it was just a financial decision where we see the salary caps growing pretty dramatically, but you also looked at the Rams and say, do we really want to lock in for 2, 3, 4 years with Matt Stafford? I think they didn't want to, especially at the price tag that I'm sure Stafford feels like he deserves, which is in the $50 million range.
Yeah, fascinating. Again, you've been all over this from the jump and just didn't seem right to you. Maybe that plan in place could be Aaron Rodgers. You floated that out there a while ago. So I think people are like, what? They're going to get rid of Matthew Stafford? It's getting closer and closer, it seems like, to that each and every day. Speaking of the Rams, they're going to lose one of their guys, the director of college scouting, to become the new GM for the Jacksonville Jaguars. 34 years young is James Gladstone. What do you make of that move? Kind of getting that off the Rams staff. And that's pretty young for a GM these days at 34. But what does that say about the Jags and the new direction replacing Trent Baalke?
Well, I mean, it is a big decision, right? I was GM at 37. I think I was probably the youngest at that time. Then I think Howie came in. We've had a couple younger, but it's certainly a young age when you've spent your career basically with the Rams and developing, strategy and analytics towards the draft. And certainly it's hard not to look at the Rams over the last couple of years and say they're doing well in the draft. Now, again, that is coming from James and what he's been able to put together, but also comes from Les Snead and obviously the coaching staff, and everybody works together to get these correct. But it's still a great opportunity to go and, I'm just thinking, financially, you're working for the Rams in LA and the California taxes, and now you're in Jacksonville, no state taxes. And it's quite a bit. That's quite a pay raise by its own right, regardless of what they give him in terms of salary. But it's going to be great. You're going to set up a new system within the Jacksonville Jaguars of what you want to do, how you're going to evaluate players and move forward. And the picks do matter. And, when you build a football team and try to, get a team back in order, these draft picks are critical. We've talked about that with Howie Roseman, the way he's hit draft picks, and we've talked about other clubs where they've been missing. And that's just the difference. And the Rams have been hitting picks lately without a lot of first-round picks, I may add. So this is the exciting hire because it's just a new, fresh face. It'll be interesting to hear him speak, and then it's just in time to get to the combine. And he's going to have to look at his staff. He's got a lot to do, because he's got not only, to get to know the new coaching staff, but he's got to get to know his scouts, which ones he likes, which ones he trusts, which ones he, so it's a lot of things that are going to happen for him real quick, but amazing opportunity nonetheless.
Mark, when you got hired at 37, I think people go, wow, like that's amazing to get that position that young here for Gladstone at 34. Like, can you be prepared you're prepared, and obviously you wouldn't have got the job, but like, is it one of those things where you go, man, if I knew then what I knew now type deal? Like, what would be some things you tell him, from today's Mark Dominik, knowing what you know versus what you knew at 37?
Yeah, there's a few things I would encourage him to do. Number one, he got there with what he's doing in scouting. And a lot of times when you become GM, you're working with coaches' contracts and players' contracts, and you're doing PR stuff. You're talking to the marketing team, and you're doing lots of, when I say PR stuff, you're making sure what's getting out of the building, what's coming, what's our messaging, what we're trying to do, what are we putting out there, what are players putting out there. So it's all that. But then also you're also doing a lot of fundraising or just like opportunity events where you're running around meeting, a lot of the people that are, donate or obviously invest in the organization. And then, oh, by the way, you were a scout once, and you got to find a way to get that back into the resume, because that's why you got hired in the first place. So delegation is the big thing that you would always say. You would like to have a lot of delegation where you're going to be able to trust somebody that can maybe handle more of the PR part that you don't have to look over. And having the right, salary cap people in place was big, that you could sit there and say, I trust the coaches' contracts are good, or this is where the free agency is. But having the time to learn that stuff, you're going to need to learn the salary cap to some extent so you can actually have very logical meetings with agents as you go down the road and your staff. I think the last thing is, and this isn't hire Mark Dominik by any stretch, so I don't mean it this way, but if I could have done it again, I would have liked to have hired an ex-GM to be like my assistant GM or director of player personnel or just a personnel executive, to be in the building that's been through the job before, whether that you can convince a Jerry Reese, Thomas Dimitroff, any of these guys that have had opportunities before. It's a shot where you could put somebody in the building that you could know that's not trying to get your job, but just trying to help you be the best you can be at your job. And that's something I really wish I'd have done my first year.
Well, I'll say this, it still worked out pretty darn well for you in the Bucs with you as a GM. And also, if I was an owner, I'd hire you in a second. Maybe I'm a little bit biased, but yeah, I would certainly want the knowledge that you certainly have. And that might help a guy like Gladstone there in Jacksonville. Speaking of kind of first time, right? Kellen Moore might need some help now being a first-time head coach in New Orleans. I know he's putting his staff together. Maybe Brandon Staley could be one of those guys, a former head coach, former really good DC. He's going to be the defensive coordinator now with Kellen Moore there in New Orleans. And Doug Nussmeier is going to be the new offensive coordinator there. That familiarity that you just talked about from a GM's perspective, what about this now? Because Brandon Staley had Kellen Moore and his staff, and now it's Kellen Moore hiring Brandon Staley to be his DC. That feels like, hey, I appreciate you then, and I appreciate you now. Kind of that role is reversed, but yet they have familiarity with what they want to do.
Yeah, I think that's a huge hire for them, right? I mean, the fact that you get somebody that Kellen Moore obviously has to be able to trust because he's been around him, that you can sit there and detach the defense and say, hey, look, I'm not worried about it. Brandon Staley's got this, and he's been a head coach before, so he can be the head coach of the defense, right? And I can focus on offense and what it got us here from an offensive standpoint. Certainly working with Doug Nussmeier, who's got a lot of experience, and former players, much like Kellen Moore, who's had coordinator spots and opportunities. So experienced staff nonetheless, which I think is very important. And again, having a guy that's on the defensive side that's been a head coach in the National Football League is such a win. But then actually having worked with him in the same building for a little bit is so much more helpful. So this is a big move for Kellen Moore in a team that's got a lot of work to do in this offseason.
Yeah, it feels like it, and it feels like a good place to start for Kellen Moore as a first-timer to have that familiarity. What about the Eagles now? When you elevate a guy from within, and Kevin Petula is going to be the new offensive coordinator, we know that obviously we figured that Kellen Moore leaving and going there. Jalen Hurts, it feels like he has a new offensive coordinator every year. I mean, he just goes back to college and a couple of different universities there, and certainly it's happened on the pro side here. Is this a good thing for Jalen Hurts as the reigning defending and Nick Sirianni that it is a guy that they're not bringing in from the outside, at least, is somebody that they're elevating within their staff.
Yeah, Dave, I agree with you. I think it's a very good thing. It's nice to be able to stick with the staff, stick with the same, verbiage, the same play call style. Obviously he's been a big part of putting together the game plans and putting everything on paper. It's going to be a great opportunity for him, but I think it's very critical that you try to stay within your organization, especially when you have a quarterback who's fairly young still, obviously, in the National Football League, and you don't want to overload him with a new and more information every year to make it more difficult for him to, be the functional quarterback he can be. So I think it's great news. I think it's great news for Eagles fans. I think it's great news for the organization and certainly for Jalen Hurts that they were able to stay within the organization and get a guy that obviously understands what they're trying to do already.
Mark, I'm sure as a GM and with that thinking cap on, this would be good news that we know the NFL salary cap is going to go up this year here. It's going to be projected to be between $277.5 million and $281.5 to go up. So that's great. You get more to spend, but everybody gets more to spend. How does that change the dynamic?
Well, it changed the dynamic. Think about what we just started the show off with, Matthew Stafford, right? You basically can cut Matthew Stafford and you have the same salary cap you had last year. That's the difference here, is because the salary cap's grown so much that you were able to get away from contracts that maybe once a long time ago you couldn't. When you made a mistake, you got burned. I mean, when I was GM back in 2009 to 2013, the salary cap went up over 5 years, $1 million total over 5 years. $1 million. It was the worst run of salary cap growth in the history of the salary cap. Those 5 years were terrible. And so it was really hard. So when you made a mistake with a contract, you had to eat it and you had no other way to get out of it. Now you can make mistakes, or you can kind of look at the way you want to load contracts. We see all the options years and things that people are doing. That's allowing this. So huge news, obviously, for NFL players too. That's a lot of money coming back in that system.
It feels like business is booming in the NFL, right? It's going to help out the front offices. It's going to help out the players. And again, when you make it on that side, you like to see you go back into the game here, into the players, more money to spend for those GMs out there as well. All right, when we come back, and I want to get to the Dog and Pony Show. That is what's going to happen in Indianapolis here. So we'll get to the Combine and what goes on with that. That is next when you come back with us right here on the GM Show.
You're listening to the GM Shuffle, presented by DraftKings and VSiN.
We are back on the GM Shuffle, presented by DraftKings and VSiN. Dave Ross alongside our GM, Mark Dominik. Mark, I feel like for the last month or so, I'm always like, man, do you guys ever get any downtime as executives, right? And then you're like, no, not really. I mean, we're going to be back at it this week with the Dog and Pony Show, as we like to say, the Combine in Indianapolis, starting up on Thursday. What is this week like? What does that mean for you guys as executives? What are you looking for when you get to Indy?
Yeah, it's a lot. It's great. It's unique. This is, I think this will be my 30. I'm saying this. I think 30th combine in a row. It's so when you think about how many combines you've been to, how many weeks I've spent in Indianapolis, I know that city probably as good as I know just about any city I've ever been in. I found a way that you don't even have to go outside in Indianapolis. There's tunnels everywhere if you kind of really know the secrets to everything. So it's a lot of interesting thought. Sadly, but 30 years. The combine's different for every year. When you kind of show up as a general manager and the way you're looking at things, you're setting your boards, you're setting your meetings all ahead of time as much as possible, right? So the goal is to not only, get the information from the medical part, right, where the players are sitting, but also all the interviews, especially the formal interviews for the general manager. It's your chance to go down and sit with, 60, 70 guys that you get to spend 20 minutes with, kind of a speed date situation, but also clear some things up on young guys, whether there's confusion on something that's happened, whether there's lack of knowledge on something because they're a younger person just came out. Maybe they only played 3 years in college ball. Maybe they've had a lot of injury history. You're trying to figure it all out, but you get to spend time with them. And I think that's the big part. And then it's the ability to sit back and kind of really meet with the agents of your players of your team. Right. So I had a suite when I would go to the combine, and I would sit in the suite and we would just stack the agents hour upon hour and have them come in and just sit down and talk to them about their players. What's going on? How they doing? What's the next step? And you could have been a rookie. You could have been an 8th year player. It was a chance for the agent to be able to walk back to the player and say, hey, I talked to your GM, which is helpful for the agents, right? Because the players are like, what's going on? What's happening? At the same point, you could gather more information about what's going on around the National Football League. And that was a big piece of the puzzle too, trying to get a sense of, what free agency looks like, what might come to the market, what might not, where markets are for certain things, certainly your players that are about to hit free agency, and maybe there's conversations about other things, as we can imagine.
And I know at the end of the show, we're going to get to some of your edge rushers that you like today, really breaking down some individuals there, and we'll get to some of the high prospects here. But it is interesting what you're noting to me. It's almost like, not to say that it doesn't matter from what the player is, but it's almost like that meet and greet. You're really trying to learn the player off the field. Are you getting as much as that you're already seeing on tape? Is not as much about the measurables. It's more about who the person is.
Yeah, for me, for the head coach too, especially, or the coordinators, the people that haven't been around, the positional coaches, the scouts have been around these guys during the season, maybe once, twice, 3 times, depending on what school it was. The directors have probably been into the school, seeing the guys. So they've got a sense of the kid's background a little bit and his feel. And what they're trying to do is make sure we get the right people in front of everybody to kind of get a sense of, is this a guy that fits into what we want to be culturally? Is this a guy that fits into what we expect, from a social standpoint? Like, what do we need to know about him? So, yeah, you do get a chance to kind of get that, that gut decision, that right. Gut feel like, I really like this guy. I don't really like this guy. There was something missing. There's not a lot of energy there, low juice. You also have to realize it from the player's perspective too, though, right? Here's guys that are flying in already, and they're going to be there for 6 days, right? And the first 3 days is basically medical and interviews. There'll be a meeting with the NFLPA. There'll be some registration things. There'll be some light testing, but nothing on the field or anything, that type of testing, more like intelligence, character analysis, those things. But 3 days straight of doctors yanking all over you, medical, x-rays, MRIs, EKGs, everything like that. And by the way, when you have the free time, go and sit in a big warehouse and have all these meetings with, positional coaches and scouts, or during the day or in the evening, you shoot over to, Lucas Oil Stadium and you have those formal interviews. And that's what you're doing. It's a wash, rinse, repeat, wash, rinse, repeat. So when you get a guy that comes into your, interview, you've got to decide, is this guy down because he's just been grinding? Or how's he doing? So one of the unique things I tell players when I talk to them about what to expect at the combine is make sure you bring noise canceling headphones. And they're like, okay, sure. Why? It's like, you don't know who your roommate's going to be. And if that dude snores, you're not going to get sleep for 6 days. And so you better have something because you're going to need your sleep because it's such a grind. But then I also remind them 6 days in the moment feels like a long time. It's like, it's day 1, it's day 2, But when you're done with the combine, you fly home next week, it's going to feel like it went in a blur. It's going to feel like, wow, I can't believe that I already did the combine. I'm going on to my pro day. It goes so fast, but in the moment, it feels really slow. So you got to make sure you keep your mindset right. And same for the organizations and clubs, making sure you're getting the most you can out of this time when you get all these clubs and teams coming together in one spot in Indy.
Fascinating. That's amazing insight. And again, those little things are the big things about the noise canceling headphones there for get your proper sleep, kids, because you're only going to go through the combine once. Mark's been there, done that. Knows exactly what he's looking for. That all begins on Thursday. We'll get more into that and some of the guys that you like in this draft coming up later on in the program. But I did want to get back to something that James Cook kind of put at least football X on a blaze a little bit. Following his big year, he just put out there a $15 million year is what he put out there, basically insinuating, hey, Brandon Beane, Buffalo Bills, I need $15 million this year. He's looking for a contract extension here. What do you do there? Because I've seen it before as a Cowboy backer with Ezekiel Elliott early in his career, and he kind of jumped the line a little bit on those contracts, and maybe that set the Cowboys back a little bit. When you pay the running back here, paying the running back has become a new, I guess it's a hot button topic in the NFL. You can make the reason to do so when you look at the success they have as Saquon Barkley, or certainly have a Derrick Henry last year. But what do you do in this case if you're Buffalo? Do you say, all right, yes, we need to talk to James Cook because we got to make sure he's happy?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised that James Cook came out and said that. $15 million a year, when you look at what Saquon got, when you look what the other backs have gotten, clearly I think the running back got undervalued. So I went from be careful, don't overvalue it. Be careful on long, the Todd Gurley's of the world, Zeke Elliott's, they never play him out. You got to be careful never to pigeonhole something as that's how it's always going to be, right? You get, I can remember back in the day, this was when I first got to Kansas City. can't say it. Nebraska Cornhuskers could not put out an offensive lineman that was worth his salt, right? Everyone was a bust. And so the whole thing was like, never draft an offensive lineman from Nebraska. The Chiefs draft Will Shields because they're like, we're not falling for that same thing that everybody says it. And voila, Will Shields now has a gold jacket. You can't just fall into that trap like running backs are overvalued. You can find them. They're a dime a dozen. Sure, you could say that, but so are wide receivers then, right? You can find wide receiver, especially wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 in a draft. You can find those guys. And so I think that the running backs that are elite are not a dime a dozen. And I think they are worthy of where the number is. I think if I'm Buffalo, I strongly consider doing maybe a 3-year extension on James Cook. And I don't think those numbers are offline. Certainly would try to like to be around 13.5, 14, but I understand where he's coming from. When you think of the production he has and what he means to that football team, and yes, do I think James Cook can play 3 more years, 4 more years? Of course I do right now. And the only thing I'd really stipulate is the running backs I pay have to be able to catch the ball.
Okay.
Right. I don't want the big heavy running back that, we're going to substitute another back in to catch the ball on third down, or I don't trust him on third down in pass coverage, pass protection. And so he's got to check all the boxes. But if you can, then I say, yeah, you know what? For what he brings, 1,500 yards of all-purpose yards, catching the ball in the backfield, big plays, and what we've seen James Cook do, I think he's worthy of that number or very close to it. And so I think it's logical, and I don't mind that he aired it out in front of public business. I really don't care at all. I'm sure, like I said, one of the people I'm going to meet, if I'm the Buffalo Bills, is James Cook's agent, and have that conversation, at least start the conversation in Indy where it can, grow. And there's no rush here. Obviously, he's got 1 year of his contract, but I think you could get something done, and I would.
Fascinating. Those are all those moving parts and tentacles here for Brandon Beane and the Buffalo Bills with James Cook. But yeah, it doesn't seem that far out of line after what we saw. Maybe hindsight being 2020, had they given him the rock more than 13 times, maybe they would have been going on to the Super Bowl instead of running Josh Allen in 4th and short. But that's a story for another day. This is a story for this year again, in that we're going back to Brazil. They're going to go back to Sao Paulo to play another game here to help kick off the 2025 season. Did it last year with the Eagles. So that was an Eagle home game. And actually, I remember thinking, oh, this is great. They'll be at a disadvantage losing a game there in Brazil. It didn't really hurt the Eagles in the end result. Chargers rumored to be one of those teams that will be involved in that game in week 1 of the NFL schedule. What do you make of this? Is this just the globalization of the NFL? And I guess they felt like it was enough of a success. I think the field was a little bit in question, if memory serves, in that first game there for the Eagles and company. But what do you make of them going back to Brazil?
Yeah, I think it is the globalization. I mean, you're going to keep tapping different markets to be able to have more sales, more jerseys, more anything, that you can kind of move in terms of marketing. And, this has been something that Roger Goodell has been very focused on, focusing on like the growth of the game and the integrity of the game. Those are really the two things that he's really pushed hard, and he's continuing to deliver year in and year out on trying to, again, get the game across the border and as far as you can into the soccer countries of the world or where they play football. And so I think it's great. I think that this is a good opportunity for him. Certainly you have now a little bit more time to make sure the field's in better shape. You played a game there. You know what strengths, what weaknesses are. You'll get something. It'll be in better shape. And I'm looking forward to us hosting the GM podcast there too, which will be amazing. Are we any chance at that? Or no, probably not a chance of hosting it there. But, I just thought I'd throw it out there in case, the right people are listening. I'm excited to do that.
We have Matt Deutsch, our new producer, so we'll see if Matt can put in a word for us here, Mark. Get you and I to Brazil to come. But, it would be amazing to see what that is like. Can we say now, because the Eagles won the Super Bowl and they played that game against Green Bay, was it not a detriment to them with all that travel at the beginning of the year?
I just don't think it is. These players are in such good shape now. It's not it's a long flight, but, we're kind of teams are used to going to London now. Teams are used to going overseas in different places. It's kind of an opportunity. Yes, it's a business trip, so you still treat it that way, and most clubs do. But I just see it as another game, and it's an opportunity to go play. And it's kind of the nice thing about them for me is when I had a chance to go twice to London with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And, the nice thing is it's a Super Bowl type of feeling there, where it's all different jerseys, but it's electric. There's a lot of excitement, and it's good for your team to feel all that, right? To kind of get that sense of like, this isn't just a normal weekly game. This is kind of a unique event, and so is the Super Bowl. So you kind of think of it as early preparation, possibly.
Yeah, it's wild. This is the new landscape of the NFL, like you mentioned. It's been going on for a while now, going overseas to England, into Germany. Now it's 2 years in a row in Brazil. That's what the NFL does. What we do is talk NFL draft. We're going to talk about that next here on the GM Shuffle.
You're listening to the GM Shuffle, presented by DraftKings and VSiN.
We are back on the GM Shuffle. Dave Ross and Mark Dominik here. Of course, it is presented by DraftKings and VSiN. Mark, I know everybody can't wait. With the first pick in the 2025 April draft, the Tennessee Titans select, and we got to try to fill in that blank. Now, Cam Ward is still the favorite to be the first overall player taken by Tennessee with that number one spot. Abdul Carter is the big riser, at least in the odds board here. He was over a $2 betting underdog to go first. Now that's been shortened to about $1.65 in the marketplace here. First of all, if they do stay at number one, does that mean that they have to go quarterback? And conversely, if they don't think it's Cam Ward at one, do you trade that pick away? Or could it really just be a conversation between Cam Ward and Abdul Carter?
Well, there's a lot to digest with those statements, right? Because I think in that said, like the Cam Ward part, there is a lot to digest there in terms of them spending more time with Cam. There's lots of things that are still coming forward with the pro day, private workouts, combine meetings, medicals. All these different things are going into the Titans' mentality of like, is Cam Ward the guy, or is it Abdul Carter? I think for me, when I watch them both, I take the defensive end, and I know you've got to get a quarterback. I get it. And I think the unique thing here will be is as we get closer to the draft, the Titans are going to tell us what's going on, right? Because they're not just going to sit there. If they're going to draft a quarterback, they're probably not going to add a quarterback to the roster, right? With Will Levis being there already, he can be the number 2/ guy, and he can compete with the starter, and it is what it is. If the Titans add an experienced veteran quarterback, it tells me that they might, okay, we're not sure Will Levis is going to be the guy, but we still have this quarterback to lean towards. That in case that Will Levis doesn't perform the way we think, or maybe we just need something else, now we could take the best player on the board, which is Abdul Carter, in my personal opinion. And so I think we're going to learn a little bit more about this. I think that line's going to keep coming down as we get closer and closer to the draft, or as we get one day further towards the draft. The writing will be on the wall, in my personal opinion, that we'll see it. If you're asking me today, before March, I'm taking and putting Abdul Carter number one. I think the other thing, but I think a lot of fans, as they kind of look to their teams, like, oh, let's say you're a Titans fan, is you're like, well, just trade down. Well, I've been in the war room, right? I've looked at that phone going, is that thing working? Yeah, because no one's calling, right? I mean, so we would literally, sometimes I would be like, pick it up, make sure there's a dial tone. And they're like, yep, there's a dial tone. I was like, dang it, that means no one wants to trade, right? So just because it sounds good, and it's like, hey, look, just trade out, get all these extra picks. Who's trading up? Like, who's the team that's like, within a fraction of where you want to be? Because you remember, every time you trade down, X amount of players are now coming off your board. And so you've got to decide, where's the depth of this draft and how far can I go down to still make sure I get an impact player? And so I think this one's unique because if you say, well, I'm just going to trade down because I don't want Abdul Carter, but I don't believe Cam Ward's the number one pick, I think that's a weird statement to say, right? Unless you're suddenly like, you don't think Abdul Carter is that good of a player, or maybe something medical we don't know about is going to come out, which I'm unaware of right now also. So again, I still have Abdul Carter number one on the board, but I think it's one of those things where, yeah, you could trade down to 5, 6. That means the other team's got to look at Cam Ward and say, like, he is the franchise quarterback. So clearly Tennessee then again goes, am I misevaluating the player? If they're so sure of it, why am I not so sure of it, right? Because I need that position. So I don't think this is such an easily traded pick, and I don't know if it's a traded pick I would do even if it was Tennessee, because I don't know if they're going to get the value that you normally would get with the number one pick based off of who's available.
It is fascinating because I feel like I don't know the GMs that you guys are listening to the outside noise, but it always feels like last year per se. The consensus was you have to take Caleb Williams, right? Number one overall, which is, of course, what Chicago did. But in D.C., they were saying, now maybe it's easier to say afterward, that if we had the number one pick, we being Washington, we're taking Jaden Daniels. Like, we are sold on this guy. We don't care what the rhetoric is. We don't care what the consensus is. We are sold on Jaden Daniels as the top quarterback that we've evaluated in this draft. How much of that is you're putting that stuff out there, or how much of that is actually true? Like, I wonder if Tennessee knows already what they want to do at one, and I don't care what the consensus is. If you tell me that Cam Ward has got to be the first pick, Do they already have their mind made up, Mark, or will this be changing parts?
It has to change still a little bit. They have their board set right now for what they know, what the knowledge is. Again, a lot of times when we watch the draft and we're like, gosh, I can't believe he's falling. It's probably because of either character or medical that sometimes we don't get all that information, right? So that's the stuff on the outside trying to figure things out. You're just not certain about what it could be or what could be the reason why for a guy to fall in the draft class. I think as you kind of look through this with Jaden Daniels, I mean, again, having done this and not this GM podcast, but last year, I was not taking Caleb Williams one. I was very adamant about that on everything I did from television to radio. That I did.
So, Mark, you would have, if that was your pick, if you were with Chicago, your evaluation was it's Jaden Daniels, and I don't care what anybody else is saying.
Yeah, I've said that. I think you could find it anywhere. If I was posted pre-draft and even post-draft, like I take Jaden Daniels, and the reason why is, and I said this, if you've heard me say it, I talked about Caleb Williams, and I think he thinks it's too easy, and it's not. There's nothing easy about playing quarterback in the National Football League. It takes a ton of work. And what do we hear about Jaden Daniels? All he did was work, work, work. And I'm not saying Caleb can't become the quarterback he wants to. I'm just saying, watching Jaden Daniels play, seeing and knowing his work ethic, listening to Nick Saban say, we had no answer for that guy. He and Brock Bowers, who turned out to be probably the two best offensive players in the entire draft class last year. And Nick Saban kind of gave you the hint before the draft. I mean, he dropped that nugget. And those are nuggets as a GM. You're just kind of like, okay, you know what? That kind of means something to me when Nick Saban says we don't have an answer for somebody. That's way different than saying this guy's a great player, right? So, I mean, those things along with just watching Jaden Daniels' versatility, I was very strong, Jaden Daniels, and I had very much concerns about Caleb Williams because, again, you don't compare yourself to Michael Jordan when you're just a rookie in the National Football League, say I'm going to win championships like Jordan. You don't do that in Chicago because that's the GOAT. And so that tells me you have a lack of understanding of what it really takes.
Courage of your convictions. You were spot on in that evaluation. Boy, a year later, how good does that call look? By the way, very quickly, take me back to John Dorsey in Cleveland when he takes Baker Mayfield #1 overall, because I don't recall that being the consensus that you had to go Baker. But, maybe some would say it cost him his job in Cleveland that year as the GM. But clearly, I think now all these years later, it kind of looks like maybe Dorsey got it right, but it took a while to get there.
Well, I mean, in my brain, Dorsey was also in Kansas City as part of that staff taking Patrick Mahomes. And so, if you look at John Dorsey's history of quarterback selections, with where he's been, with the Green Bay Packers, obviously, in Kansas City, he's part of the Detroit staff with what's going on with Jared Goff and everything. I would kind of lean towards John Dorsey and ask him his opinion of these quarterbacks because he's been really good at it. And that's something I think people kind of overlook in terms of John Dorsey. And Baker Mayfield has proven to be worthy of the #1 pick. And he was not the overall consensus. There were people that were not quite sure about his size and frame and, his makeup and things like that. But now Baker's proved it. And at a different organization, and of course, for the Cleveland Browns, it's not with them. So sadly, another opportunity's come and gone. But, Dorsey has had tremendous success in evaluating quarterbacks through his entire career. And he's been a scout for a long time.
I'd be listening to you, too, after the assertion that Jaden Daniels would have been your #1 pick last year over Caleb Williams. So just for FYI, everybody out there listening. Let's get to one thing that we know is a trait that you're going to be looking for in Indianapolis, and it shows up on tape, and that is speed. And we saw it with Xavier Worthy last year. I think it moved him in the first round, and I know everybody's like, Buffalo, how did you not take him? And he goes to Kansas City. We saw how good he was as a rookie. When you see guys this year on tape with that speed, obviously I think we think of Travis Hunter as well. But what about a guy like, say, Arian Smith here at Georgia at wide receiver? What are you seeing and what are you looking for? Is it just that true sprinter speed or football speed?
Well, it's sprinter speed. I mean, when you've got speed like that, sometimes people talk about turning it over. What does that mean? Turning it over is like when you get the 20. That's why scouts want to see the 10 times, 20 times, 30 times, and 40 times, because you get a sense of, does the guy accelerate all the way down to 40 yards, or sometimes guys can't, quote unquote, turn it over. So they may have a good 10, good 20, but not have a great 40. But that's okay because we don't play a lot of games 40 yards, right? You think of offensive line, defensive line, linebackers. Like, if your linebacker's running 40 yards, we got problems, right? Something's going really wrong. Your offensive line's running 40 yards. It's probably a bad interception, right? So, you got to look at the numbers for what they mean. But when you find a guy like a Xavier Worthy, Then you're seeing the 10s, 20s, and 40s are all elite numbers, right? They're 1-3s at the 10, right? You're going to look for the 1-3 range, like 1-3-3, 1-3-2, 1-3-4, because a lot of guys are in the 1-4s and 1-5s, and they're still going to run a good 40, but the elite guys are in the low 1-3s, is what you always look for. And then you see if that turns over to the 20s, and then it obviously turns to the 40s. Arian Smith has got to be one that you have to consider could break Xavier Worthy's record. He is that fast. He will be. I think he will be in the 4.2s. I just don't know if he can get to the bottom of 4.2s. And that's fine. That's rare air, but he's got that kind of build and that kind of makeup that I think he's a legitimate guy. I know we kind of have a list of guys, two other kind of sleepers that no one talks about that I think have a chance to run really fast. As Darian Porter and Dorian Strong are two guys that maybe a lot of people haven't heard those names before. Those are two names I'd put on my hit list of like, they could run really fast and they could be in the 4.3s or scratch the 4.2s as well. But I think Arian's the only one that I think can go get that 4.2 or have a shot at it, so it's going to be fun to watch.
Mark, when you mentioned that you're actually breaking this down even more so than the 40, you're looking for that first 10 yards. Is that the burst, especially for receivers off the line? Like, I need that burst speed to separate, especially if it's jam coverage. Like, how does that play into it versus that straight line speed, as you mentioned? Or maybe they can catch up in the 40, but, man, I need that burst off the ball.
Yeah, it's one of those ones like, think of Anquan Bolden. I think he had a pretty good 10 time, but didn't have a great 40 time, right? But it still is an amazing football player, in the National Football League. So you're definitely looking at the different ways that maybe they can use. Here's the thing, does their speed show up on tape the way that they ran at the combine, right? There's some guys that run faster pads that, don't run a great 40, but when they put shoulder pads on, they don't really lose any speed, right? You're trying to look for those kind of things where does it match, does it make sense? And so when the guy runs a great time, but you're like, I never saw that speed on film, or vice versa. A guy runs slower and you're like, but he feels faster. And there's lots of different things you break down. So yeah, you break down the 10s, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, because you kind of look each individual one. Another thing that we would do, and I'm sure other clubs do, is the defensive line. How many steps do they, how much depth, how far do they get on their first 3 steps? So is it 1, 2, 3 steps and they're at the 5-yard line or at the 7-yard line, right? You're just kind of looking like, what's the kind of, like, how fast can he get to the edge of the quarterback? Because he's kind of got a 3-point stance and he's kind of shooting out. So, the guy that can get to 7, 8 yards in 3 steps might be able to get the edge better on the offensive tackle. So you're not just looking at the time because it's a hard one to click and get, but you are looking at the depth of a player gets on those first 3 steps for like a defensive lineman. So there's lots of different ways we break down the 40.
That's fascinating. Again, I go back to Mike Sherrard before he had his leg injuries, Ronaldo Nehemiah, trying to get these, sprinters and make them wide receivers, not that easy in the NFL. Let's get to some of those edge rushers next here on the GM Shuffle.
You're listening to the GM Shuffle, presented by DraftKings and VSiN.
Enjoying the conversation here on the GM Shuffle with our GM, Mark Dominik. I am Dave Ross. This is the GM Shuffle presented by DraftKings and VSiN. Mark, again, you're going to be there in Indianapolis for the Combine. This week, of course, all eyes will be on the April draft. So I want to break down, using your expertise here, some of these edge rushers that we're going to see coming up in this draft. Now, look, all eyes are going to be on Abdul Carter. I think I was most impressed, Mark, just watching him play hurt. Right? And I know, in a bowl game, you're like, man, do you even want the kid out there hurt? Like, to me, that said something. That even though he knew he could potentially be the number 1 pick in the draft, he still went out there with one arm and kind of dominated. What do you see when you watch Abdul Carter? And is he everything that guys that normally wear 11 at Penn State, like a Michael Parsons, does that translate to the next level?
Yeah, I love those schools that have certain jersey numbers where if you get to put that number on, it means something. I love that. I just think that's so classic, old school, great, whether it's Syracuse, LSU. There's some schools that do it, but number 11, certainly Penn State is an honor to wear, and he's worn it well. When you think about Abdul Carter, he's going to be 6'2"-ish. He's going to be 255-ish at the combine, somewhere in that range. He had 12 sacks last year, but I think he had a lot more impact than just the 12 sacks, and that's what you kind of look for when you're watching him. The number one thing that Abdul Carter has, which, again, I think he is the number 1 prospect in the draft, and I think he is the number 1 pick in the draft, because of these things. He shows up everywhere on the football field, and he can do it all, Dave. He's almost like, as much as he's an edge rusher, he's a check-the-box linebacker, meaning that he can pick off the ball. He's great in his drops, like really good in drops. You can feel like you can play him off the ball and play him at linebacker and don't have to put him up at the line of scrimmage. He can do that because he's that athletic. He's got great movement skills, great bend and flexibility in his ankles, his knees, his back. Those are different areas where we'll try to look at players and say, where's some stiffness coming from? Sometimes it's in the ankles, sometimes it's in the knees, sometimes it's in the back. And you try to look at that and see where's that coming from in terms of Abdul Carter. You say, no, none, doesn't have it. He's got all those things in terms of flexibility. But the biggest thing he has is what's called a burst or speed to close. When he sees it and tracks it, and it's very easy, like with the instincts that he has, he can blur sometimes on tape. He's just like, whoa, that was fast. How did he get to that guy so quickly? So he keeps his feet moving all the time. He plays, again, multiple positions. He can play all over the field, left, right, back drops. I love what he can do. He gets skinny when he's in a crowd, meaning, he's able to kind of split through, that double team of that guard center or center guard tackle. He can absolutely drop his weight and get in there and be able to turn his shoulder, but still have the power to work through that, which is really important. And he's got the bull rush. He's got multiple pass rushes. He doesn't just throw the fastball. He doesn't just bull rush. He's got a spin move that's really good. He's got some chop moves that are really good. So he's got multiple pass rushes. So again, I know that everybody's going to watch him and everybody's going to have opinions on him, and most people are going to be exactly what we're saying. But when you break him down, you say, okay, where's his weakness? If he doesn't make it, it's, then something must have happened physically on the football or off the football field for him not to make it. He feels that confident to me that this is a guy that's good to go and is worthy of the number one pick.
I love it. And again, that breakdown from the 11s at Penn State, I covered LeVar Arrington in his DC days, and that guy had closing speed. He closed on Troy Aikman. We all remember that hit. Ended Troy's career in the sideline there. And then, of course, what we see with Micah Parsons right now with the Cowboys. But what it feels like the difference in what I'm hearing from you is, no, I love Micah. Don't get me wrong. I love Micah. But that's not normally a guy you want to see in space. You want him to get after the quarterback. Dare I say, does Abdul Carter, because, one guy named Lawrence Taylor could drop back in coverage and do it all. You hate to do that to any kid, but do you see any LT Abdul Carter?
He's an impact hitter. LT was, as much as he was an athlete, he could smash people, right? You remember him hitting and tackling. He hurt people on impact. It's because he had that burst to close, that acceleration within a short area where when you can do that, that hit, that feeling is just significant. So I hate to put a guy on that kind of pedestal, but I think it's a guy that you sit there and say, I think he's defensive rookie of the year. I think the guy plays, hopefully a long time. No one really can project what's going to happen in the guy's career, but he certainly has the tools to be up there. Even more, Derek Thomas is another name where you think about some of the elite guys. DT was built a little bit more like Abdul Carter than I would say that, Lawrence Taylor was, but Lawrence was just such a freak. I can't really say anybody's ever going to be Lawrence Taylor because he was that good. But I will say that I did get to do this, which is separate. And sorry, I'm just going to hijack this for 10 seconds.
What?
At the Super Bowl, I chanced to meet Bruce Smith, which I had not met Bruce Smith in life. And I was very honored to be able to meet Bruce Smith. And the people that don't know his game, maybe the younger people that are listening, I encourage you to, as much as you might have heard of LT, you need to go back and look at Bruce Smith too, because that guy was amazing. So it was really a pretty big deal to me. I usually don't get a little starstruck at all with players at all. And it was like, that's Bruce Smith. So it's like meeting LT in my mind.
By the way, I'm sure this will be a shock to you. I used to work out with Bruce Smith at Waring's Gym in Virginia Beach, Virginia. Which kid stopped working out? Which one continued? Yeah, Bruce was already a legend at Virginia Tech at that day, in those days back in my Virginia Beach upgrade. But what an honor it was for me to see in my gym, my local gym, Bruce Smith every offseason. Boy, what a great recall. That guy, as good as it gets. And by the way, if Abdul Carter can be half as good as Derek Thomas, he'll be in Canton, Ohio, like DT is, and certainly LT. Wow, love that recall. What about a guy like Michael Williams out of Georgia? If you don't get Abdul Carter, is this the second guy you'd target for these edge rushers?
It's going to be dependent on what system you want to run. I think that's going to play into it. So again, when we're doing here on this podcast, we'll do this all the way up to the draft. Just grab some players, we'll break them down and put a kind of a round on them. The way I did it, just to kind of give some notice, is I would do, you could say a guy's a first rounder. I'd like to separate it better, right? I like a 1.0 to a 1.5 to a 1.9. So obviously the difference is the 1.0s are guys that you think are going to go first to 10. When I say 1.5 or 2.5 or 3.5, I think they're the middle of the second round or the first round. So 1.5 is anywhere from like maybe 11 to 21. And then the 1.9s are like, hey, I think he's like pick 22 to 32. So whenever I say a grade on the guy is going forward with these, as our listeners are listening, I might go, he's a 1.5. So Abdul Carter obviously is a 1.0. I think the next two guys are 1.5s. I think it just depends on what you want to use. But Mikal Williams is the bigger body. He's the big one of these guys that are edge rushers that are going to go off the board, I think, the earliest. To me, he's got such great length. You've got to decide what you want to use him in, because he can be a 3-4 guy. He can be a 4-3 guy. But I think because of his power and his effort, you're going to like that. There is a little tightness in him that I think shows up a little bit. Or I should say his pad level. And again, we're critical, right? That's what we do. So I still think this guy's a 1.5, right? I think he's going in the first round. But if you're telling me what's the things that Abdul Carter doesn't do that Williams does, is he's still going to always have to work on his pad level. That's going to be something that you watch with him. It kind of affects him a little bit sometimes in terms of getting off the ball quicker, because now he's popping up a little bit instead of popping out, if that makes sense. But he's got great strength, great length. He does have a burst to close, which is really important as a defensive lineman. He can work out of a 2-point stance. He can work out of a 3-point stance. But he's really powerful against the run, too. That's the one thing I really like about him is his length against the run. You feel his arm length and the way he can get his arms on the inside of offensive linemen and actually control them instead of them trying to control him. So you like that. And again, the pad level stuff is stuff you're going to continue to work on and talk to him about. So there's coachability there. But I think he's like 6'4", he's 260 pounds. I think there's a lot of versatility there. I think you're going to get a guy that's going to be a good rusher, but I think he's more the 5 to 10 sack guy. I don't think he's a 10 sack guy in the National Football League. But, I think he's a great player. It just depends on what you're looking for in your defense. If you're looking for a classic left end, I think he could play that.
It seems like we keep going back to the Kirby Smart here from Georgia, and then you have Jalen Walker as well. You have him in that same range, 10 to 20 there, maybe as a 1.5 guy?
I do, and I think Jalen's right next to him. I got him as a 1.5 guy as well, and you said it right. I think what he does is he can, really tracks the ball exceptionally well. He's got great instincts. I think that's really what helps Jalen Walker to me, because he's more that 6'2", 240. So again, we're a couple inches smaller, 20 pounds less, which makes a big difference with everything in the National Football League. I think he's really, shown a lot of production, even though the sack numbers were 6.5. In terms of impact plays, it was a lot more than 6.5, right? So his sack numbers could be a little misleading. Even Williams had 5 sacks last year. This Georgia defense was getting after people from the left side, from the right side, and everywhere and anywhere. Jalen, I think, is a great run player too, which sometimes you don't get as much with these edge rushers. You see the guys that just go get the quarterback. But he's a really good, instinctive football player who tackles well. Fundamentally, he's great at tackling, the way he wraps opponents up, the way he makes sure that when he gets a piece of you, you're going down. You're not falling forward as a running back. You're not losing those extra yards you look for. So I really think he's a super talented guy. He's got great knee bend in terms of, getting after, dropping his edge around the corner. Little tightness, I'd say, and maybe his hips are a little tighter in terms of that final drop around the edge, but he can do it, and he's got enough speed where he can beat you with his fastball. So I think Jalen Walker's easily, again, mid-teens type of pick, and certainly comes off the board in the middle of the first round.
Let's stay at the SEC here for the edge rushers and talk about James Pierce Jr. Where do you have him slated? Is he a guy that is still in the 1.5s, or is he in the 2 range?
So I've got him as a 1.9. So I think he's going to go towards the bottom of the first round. So anywhere, again, like 21 to 32, I think is a real possibility. Strong-bodied guy. He shows up a little bit more in terms of a little tightness that you kind of go in his lower back. Okay, so what that means is what you're going to see is he's trying to get the edge or trying to get around the corner. It's going to be maybe an extra step or so. Might make it a little bit harder for him to do that. Now, what he is he's all muscle all over, right? He's built beautiful. He's got strong bodied. He can push the pocket. He's got great hand placement in terms of, like, if you want him to walk your tackle back into your quarterback, you want James Pierce. Like, he's going to be able to do that. I do think he can get to 10 sacks. So I don't think he's going to be a limited guy that doesn't have the ability to get to 10 sacks because I think he's got the effort and the pursuit that you really want as well as a good fundamental tackler. So again, all these things make him a first-round pick. It's just a little bit different flavor of what you're going to get from each one of them. But again, I think to me, it's Carter, Walker, Williams, and Pierce if I had to rank those 4.
Last year, 4 guys went in the first round as edge rushers, and Chop Robinson, Jared Verse, Dallas Turner, and Latu with the Colts. If you redrafted that now, would it be easy to say Verse is the best guy? But you had high grades on all 4 of these guys, right?
Yeah, and I think Verse, Latte was, you're kind of, everybody's still worried about the medical, what was going to happen or how was that going to look. I wasn't probably as high on Chop as he turned out to be obviously a solid player, but Verse was the one that, I think people just kind of underestimated his athleticism, and they're like, he ran a good 40. He didn't run a fast 40. He ran a good. But again, you watch him on tape, and then you know who he is as a person. Jared Verse is one of the great guys in last year's draft class across the board. Forget what position he plays or anything else. He's one of those super dudes that you're just like, you want him in your locker room. And I think he's proved that he owns all the stats and all the traits. He got what he deserved this year. Great pick by the Rams.
Yeah, Rams are pretty happy with that pick. Mark, safe travels to Indianapolis, my friend. I can't wait to talk to you next Monday to see what you glean from Indy. So until then, for Mark Dominik, I'm Dave Ross. Thanks for listening and watching the GM Show.